Hi everyone, I'm Jenna, and in today's video I'm going to share with you guys all the books I read in 2021. And I'm going starting with the very first book that I read and then going chronological order all the way to the very last book that I read. And with each book that I talk about, I'm going to be giving you the star rating of that book. And then at the end of the video, like I've done for the past 2 years, I'm going to be giving you the stats on my reading, like how many books I read, how many pages, shortest book, longest book, what genre did I read the most of, and things like that, which I think will be fascinating. So I have a lot of books to talk about and show you, so let's just dive on into this. The first book that I read is Across the Green Grass Fields, which is the 7th book in the Wayward Children's series by Seanan McGuire, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. The second book I read is Ready Player 2, which is the 2nd book in the Ready Player duology by Ernest Cline, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read 5 Feet Apart by Rachel Lippincott, and this is a reread which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars, just like I did the first time. The next book is All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven, and this is a reread which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars, just like the first time I read it. Then I proceeded to read Jennifer Niven's second book called Holding Up the Universe, and I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It just wasn't as good as All the Bright Places, unfortunately. Then I read a YA fantasy called The Last Magician, which is the first book in the Last Magician series by Lisa Maxwell, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and this is the first book in her new trilogy series. I'm not exactly sure which, but I know there's more than one book. And this one I gave a 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Truth of You, Poetry About Love, Life, Joy, and Sadness by Ian S. Thomas, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Sourdough, or Lois and Her Adventures in the Underground Market by Robin Salone, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. And the next book is Blue Moon, which is the 3rd and final book in the Midnighters trilogy by Scott Westerfeld, and this book is a reread which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Then I read Elatso, or Elatsoe, not sure how to pronounce that, by Darcy Little Badger, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Light Filters In, Poems by Caroline Kaufman, and this is ones that I read on my Kindle, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. And then I read a YA fantasy called The Gilded Ones by Nina Forna. This is a first book in a trilogy, and I gave this one a 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read a contemporary book called God-Shaped Hole by Tiffany Di Bartolo, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read a YA graphic novel called Heartstopper, and this is volume 3 by Alice Oseman, and this one I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read another Tiffany Di Bartolo book called How to Kill a Rock Star, and this one I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Then I read Switch by A.S. King, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read my first slightly horror book called House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland, and this one I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Then I read Better Together by Christine Riccio. This is her second book, and this one I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Then I read We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Then I read House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. And the next book that I read is a horror book called The Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, and the only reason why I read this book is because Stephen Chbosky wrote it, and surprisingly, I loved it and gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, and this is the first book in a trilogy, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Sourdough, or Lois and Her Adventures in the Underground Market by Robin Sloan, and I still give it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, and I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Assassin's Blade, which is comprised of 5 prequel novellas, and I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read the conclusion to Simon and Baz trilogy, and the third one is called Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell, and this book I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Take Me With You When You Go by David Leviathan and Jennifer Niven, and these are 2 of my favorite authors, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read a book that's been on my shelf for a while called Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Clap When You Land, which is a book written in verse by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read is a children's book that I reread called Harold and the Purple Crayon by Cratchit Johnson, and this book I gave, just like the first time, a 5 out of 5 stars. So those are all the 33 books that I read in 2021. And my goal was to read 50, but as you can see, I didn't reach that goal. And I think the main reason why I didn't reach my goal of 50 books is because at the end of September, I was reading a book that my enjoyment of it just kept going up and down throughout my experience of it, and I finally had to say no and put the book down and move on, because it was just taking me a very long time to slowly make my way through it, and I just never really had an excitement to pick that book up and read it. And I think that put me into a slight reading slump, so that's why it's 33 books. So now let's get on to how many pages I read. And I read 12,283 pages in total, which blows my mind. And then the shortest book I read is Harold and the Purple Crayon by Cratchit Johnson. And this comes at no surprise because it's a children's book, and those are normally short, and this one comes in at 64 pages. And now I'll talk about the longest book that I read, which is this big book called Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, and this book comes in at 705 pages. So it's chunker, and it took me a long time to read this book. Now on to the next stat, which is how many books I read in each of the genres that I read. I read fantasy books, contemporary books, a couple poem books, and, which is really surprising to me, I read horror. So the one that comes in with the most books read in it is contemporary books, coming in at 16. And then fantasy is the next one, which has 12 books in it. And then we have poem books, which comes in at 3. 2 of those are actual poem books, and the third one is a novel written in verse. So I decided just to include it here because it's basically the same thing. And then I have 2 horrors, which I'm so surprised that I have on here because I don't like anything really scary, because when I get scared, I get really scared, and I just don't like that. But I think about these two just, I guess, worked. I don't know. But I really enjoyed these two. So it doesn't mean I'm going to be reading a whole lot of horror in the future. I read 2 of them this year, so go me. And then I decided to see what age range I read in. And YA book, which are young adult books, are the biggest one, which is no surprise to me, and that is 20 books in that one. And then for adult books, I read 12, and then children's books, I read only 1. And then for what format I read in, the highest is physical books coming in at 29. And then the second is audiobooks coming in at 2. And then I read 1 book on Kindle. And then I decided to look at star ratings. And for that, I have 5 stars, 4 stars, and 3 stars. And nothing below that. So 5 stars has the most with 17. And then 4 stars has 12. And 3 stars, there are 3 books in that one. And then I decided to look at how many books I reread versus how many books I read new to me. And surprisingly, I read 6 rereads. I knew I read a bunch, but 6 is it's a little more than I thought. And for new books, I read 27 books. So yeah, those are the stats and all the books that I read. I really hope you liked getting to know my wrap up of my year, and hopefully in the next couple of days I'll be getting you guys my next video, which is my favorite books of 2021. So hope to see you then. Bye!